Uh, Perfect. One of the biggest groupies is not in the room yet. Where's Shani? There are some die-hard Father Jim Martin groupies that are going to be part of this audience. I'm glad. So here we go. Reverend James Martin, S.J., is a Jesuit priest, editor-at-large of America Magazine, consultant of the Vatican Secretariat for Communications, and author of numerous books, including the New York Times bestsellers, Jesus, A Pilgrimage, and the Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything. Among his other books, My Life with the Saints and Between Heaven and Earth were named by Publishers Weekly as best books of the year, and 3 of his books have received Christopher Awards as well. Father Martin is a frequent commentator on the national and international media, having appeared on all the major networks and in such diverse outlets as the Colbert Report, Fresh Air, On Being, Fox and Friends, PBS NewsHour, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, as well as the History Channel, BBC, and Vatican Radio. Before entering the Jesuits in 1988, he graduated from the Wharton School of Business. He's a wonderful person, lucky enough to be in the same congregation with him. And so, Father Martin, welcome. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you very much. That's a very kind thing. And I'm happy to be in the Society of Jesus with you too. Happy to be with you. Thank you for allowing me to do this virtually. You just saved me 3 days of travel. And of course, in terms of Laudato Si, right? We need to be conscious of the environment. Thank you for all the great work you do at Blessed Sacrament. So Jack or Father Benz sent me the questions. I hope that I can be asked them directly if you'd like later on. But as Jack was saying, I'm going to frame some of my comments at the beginning, a little mini presentation, kind of around what the questions were about, which is really Pope Francis and his relationship with the LGBTQ community. And I was thinking, as I was thinking about tonight's talk, that I would focus it on 3 moments that have happened in the last couple of years. Normally with groups like yours, I talk about gospel passages and why we need to reach out, but I think you're pretty sophisticated and know all that stuff. And I think you'd like more of an update of where the church is. And those 3 moments are the Synod, what happened at the Synod of Bishops in October, Fiducia Supplicans, which was released in December, approving same-sex blessings in certain situations. And then just Monday's document, Dignitas Infinita, which is so new that I'm not sure how to say infinita, if it's infinita or infinita or whatever. I'm sure the pronunciation will get standardized. So I think these 3 things that have happened in the church are really significant moments, and I want to talk about each one. So what happened at the Synod? So I was honored to be a delegate to the Synod of Bishops, which really began its process in 2021 with local parish and diocesan sort of sharing sessions. And then those were kind of gathered together by different bishops' conferences or episcopal conferences into documents. So all the different sharing sessions were summarized by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and they put out a document which was public and very good, very blunt, very open. The Episcopal Conference documents were gathered at what was called the continental level. So it's basically kind of a process of gathering together all these documents. And then finally, the document was brought together in something called the working document, the Instrumentum Laboris. The Latin sounds a lot better, much more sophisticated, which was the foundation of the discussions that we had at the Synod. At the Synod, there were 350 delegates, most appointed by by bishops' conferences, but 70, including me, were appointed by Pope Francis. It was very blunt. It was very open. We met for 4 weeks. We had great methodologies, which I can talk about how we listened to one another. We had different rounds where people would talk. No one could interrupt. There were reports to the main group, the plenary session. It sounds kind of boring, but it was a real experience of listening. And then at the very end, a synthesis document came out. So what's probably the most salient for your group, and I would say for myself, I think one of the reasons that Pope Francis appointed me was specifically the ministry I do with LGBTQ people. I think that was pretty clear. So LGBTQ issues were in fact talked about a lot at the Synod. That may not come through as quite as much in the synthesis document. And how did they come up? Well, I would say in general, 75% of the Synod delegates, most of whom were cardinals and archbishops and bishops, but certainly one of the great sort of innovations of this Synod was for the first time we had men and women from religious orders. And more importantly, we had lay men and lay women who had full voting rights. They called us the non-bishops. You know, slightly pejorative, but not too pejorative. And the non-bishops, you know, had the same rights as everyone else. I would say that among those people, this is a guesstimate, roughly 75% of them saw the need for greater inclusion and welcome for LGBTQ people worldwide. I think that's fair to say. Okay. Now, you had delegates from places in sub-Saharan Africa, places in Eastern Europe. I mean, places where they didn't even want to use the term LGBTQ. That was the first thing. There were many people quite a few people who said, I'm not using that term. It's political, right? It is an ideology. It is colonialism. It is being foisted upon us, all right? So while most people felt the need and the desire to welcome LGBTQ people, there were a group of people who felt that even that terminology was wrong. Then there was a small but vocal group of people who were quite, I would say, opposed to the entire project. Okay, so would say things like, this is completely an ideology. It doesn't exist. We shouldn't talk about it. It's sinful. We should welcome them as sinners. So I would say that the conversation was quite open and quite blunt, both at the tables and both in the plenary sessions. I made 2 interventions to the plenary session. One of them was telling the story. I thought it was really important to tell the stories of LGBTQ people. Do you know what I mean? Not just talk about them as theories or ideologies or concepts, but as people. And a number of people came up to me afterwards and said, thank you for doing that. There were just as many people who talked about it as an ideology. And we'll talk about that later in this document that just came up. So I would say that there wasn't a lot of consensus around LGBTQ issues, but there was certainly a lot of discussion. Now, some people might think that's a little discouraging, but this is the first time this has been discussed so openly in a sort of church-wide setting. So I compared it to it's almost like coming out, right? I mean, there's a big explosion sometimes and then things settle down. So the conversation was quite blunt, quite open, but there wasn't really a consensus. Towards the end, in the synthesis document, the theologians and writers talk about trying to welcome people with different sexual orientations. All right. In the Italian, it is even more specific. It's gender identity and sexual orientation. They took out the term LGBTQ because they felt if they left that in, some of these sections would not pass, and they all needed a 2/3 majority. And so that was their strategic decision to keep the ideas in, right, of reaching out to people, but not using the terminology. So the Synod was quite, like I said, it was quite lively discussion. And I will say to all of you people in this room that I felt it was my responsibility to really advocate for LGBTQ people, among other things. That was not the only reason I was there. But I felt that there were a few people who were really there who could kind of be that kind of voice. And I tried to do that as best as I could in the groups, but also one-on-one. You know, I went up to people one-on-one who had expressed, obviously, like sort of, I would say, opposing or critical views. And I tried to understand where they were coming from. All right, so that was the Synod document, which came out at the end of October. A couple of months later, to the surprise of, I would say, most people in the Vatican, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the Vatican's theological watchdog, under Cardinal Fernandez, who was a Francis appointee, came out with a document, as you know, called Fiducia Supplicans, on supplicating love. Not the best title. Sounds better in Latin. And it allowed for, in some situations, the blessing of same-sex unions. Now, where did that come from? Well, 2 or 3 years ago, as you recall, before Cardinal Fernandez was appointed, under Cardinal Ladaria, the question had come up from many people, but primarily from the German Bishops' Conference, and they issued what was called, or they sent in what was called a dubium. So the dubium, from the Latin word for doubt, basically means we need clarity on this. And the CDF then, now the DDF, put out a document that said that God cannot and does not bless sin, right? Which, as I'm sure you all probably remember that, which really caused a lot of consternation among people. Fiducia Supplicans sought to respond to that under this new Cardinal Fernandez, under the new prefect, and allowed, under certain conditions, the blessing of same-sex unions. Those conditions are, it can't be liturgical. It obviously, basically, it can't look like a marriage. It can't lead people to believe that it is in any way a marriage. It can't be planned. It can't be liturgical. You can't have vestments, those kinds of things. And so people started to do that. Almost immediately, there was pushback. And the pushback came, probably the most strong pushback came from a place where, if you've been following the synod, you would not be surprised, from sub-Saharan Africa. Not all of Africa, not northern and southern Africa, but basically sub-Saharan, Central Africa. They put out a document saying that this could not be implemented in their dioceses because they felt it was wrong, and they also felt it was, I'm paraphrasing, too difficult culturally. The Vatican went along with that, which was kind of extraordinary, but I think my sense, and I'm not speaking for the Pope, but they sensed that, this really wasn't acceptable in their cultures, and they weren't going to push it. They weren't going to force. This is a kind of synodality in itself, right? Kind of looking at things on the local level. All right. So that seemed to have calmed down. And then there were these rumors of this new document, which was released on Monday, Dignitas Infinita. Now, one of the interesting things about this document, or something to know, is that it had been in the works for 5 years. That's kind of important. That means that it was in the works before Cardinal Fernandez took over. All right, and when Cardinal Ladaria was still there. So the question is, how much did it change under Cardinal Fernandez? How much was it softened? The document is very wide-ranging. It talks about poverty, it talks about human trafficking, it talks about sex abuse, it talks about migrants and refugees, abortion, surrogacy, and it also talks explicitly about gender ideology. In the section on gender ideology, it starts out by saying, very positively, that it reiterates the Vatican's call against the criminalization of same-sex people. That talks about sexual orientation. Again, they don't use the term LGBTQ because that's such a flashpoint. And imprisonment, right, and execution. So it takes a very strong stand against that, which is all for the good. Now, I always remind people that overseas, that's a big deal. Here in the United States, we might think, oh, okay, big deal, right? But in a lot of countries, that is a big deal because there are still countries where the bishops support criminalization and penalties. The next step was it talked about gender ideology. And I was just talking to a friend of mine just before I signed on. This is a great topic of interest, particularly in Europe. Right, this gender. Now, what is gender ideology? Well, there's 2 ways of looking at it. You can look at it and say that it is the theory that gender is kind of a social construct. I'm sure you've read all of this stuff before. And that rather than being assigned genders, we kind of, society gives them to us. That's a real sort of simple definition of it. But the other way that gender ideology is used is kind of sometimes as a weapon against the LGBTQ community, right? By saying that, for example, transgender people are just the result of an ideology, or even lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are responding to an ideology, right? In the Vatican, there's a great deal of opposition to it. There's a great deal of fear around it because they think, they go back to the idea of, male and female. He created them. It annuls differences between the sexes. It confuses people. So there's a very strong thing in there about against gender ideology. And then finally, which was something of a surprise, what they call sex change, what we would probably call transitioning. And so also taking a strong stance against that, against sex change. So how are we to understand all that is going on? Well, I mean, I think what we're seeing is the Vatican trying to respond as best as it can from the synodal point of view to listening to people's experiences, right? But also knowing that the universal church is not of one mind, hardly. It certainly doesn't think like the people in the room do, right? Overall, I mean, some people do. And then looking at it from a pastoral standpoint, right, which is fiducia supplicans. How can we respond to people pastorally who want God's blessing for their existence, basically, this couple. They're very clear that you're not blessing the union or blessing the couple. And then the third thing is, how do we respond to this issue that seems to be of concern to so many people, and not just the transgender experience and whether or not transgender people should be admitted to schools and things like that. Cardinal Fernandez came out with a statement saying that they could be godparents and witnesses at weddings, but that this specific gender ideology thing, and then more specifically sex change. So I would say, you're all intelligent people. I would say that the church is really confronting these questions. Sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. Sometimes it feels like 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards. And it can be confusing to people. And I mean, even someone, you know, I follow this stuff all the time, and it can be hard to kind of keep up with. So that's a little bit of a lay of the land of what's been going on in the last, gosh, since October. It's only 6 months ago. It's a lot. I think I'm very hopeful because we are finally addressing these questions. We're finally bringing them out into the open. Pope Francis, in a recent book, even used the term himself, LGBTQ. So it's you know, kind of, as I said, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But I'm still very hopeful because I think, you know, particularly and something new. It's not surprising that there would be a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of pushback. Again, I compare it to kind of coming out. Big explosive revelation, and then people have to kind of deal with it. And there's sometimes like I said, there's setbacks sometimes. Anyway, so those are the 3 things I see as paramount in what's going on in the church today. The Synod, which concluded in October, and our next session will be next October. Fiducia Supplicans, which was released at the end of December. And then Dignitas Infinita or Infinita, which was just released on Monday. So I'm happy to answer those individual questions if someone wants to pose them, or just questions that happen to come up from the audience. So thanks very much. End of presentation.
Thank you for setting that context. That's really helpful. Do people have questions? I mean, I know there's a lot of questions, but where do you want to start?
Don't be shy, and you can ask whatever you want.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah. Comment or question?
Yeah, well, this is not really a question, really more a comment or conclusion. I have a conclusion based on fiducia supplicans. Apparently, there was a controversy about the fiducia supplicans, where some, even people of the clergy, call it, didn't like it, didn't agree with this document from Pope Francis. My conclusion, because of the confusion that whether it was attached or could look like a sacrament, and why my conclusion is we all need to be blessed. Clergy, as well as the clergy, as well as the lay people. Exactly. So we all, both sides, are attached to the five senses. Meaning, meaning we both have the responsibility to have to carry out the prudence of fortitude and temperance, to carry out the temperance, both sides. It's not only one side. So the virtue has to be carried out by both sides. Both sides have a responsibility, and both sides need to be blessed and have the right to the blessings.
I just want to be clear on the question. I'm not sure what I appreciate what you said. I wasn't sure what your question is at the end.
So that's not a question. It's really a conclusion that I have based on the document from Pope Francis about fiducia supplicans.
So your idea is that both sides really need to be blessed. Is that accurate?
Yes, instead of rejecting, instead of questioning whether, in this case, the question about whether the LGBTQ should be blessed because of may appear to be a sacrament, and I think that everybody needs a blessing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
As well as the lady.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the foundation of the document. The document begins, it's a kind of theology of blessing. And it talks about, you know, a blessing being sort of a desire for God's presence in a person's life, you know, which is true, and says that we all need blessings. I think the difference, though, is, and the reason that it really, you know, it did upset certain people, is that it is the first time that it's talking about blessing same-sex couples. And it does say that, and I mean, I know you know this, it does say that in the document clearly, and that really upset a lot of people. So it wasn't just two people that happened to be coming together to a church or a priest or whatever. It was, they are same-sex couples, and they made the distinction between blessing the union as if it were a wedding and just blessing this couple that was coming up. But it was, I think there were a lot of commentators that tried to sort of explain it away and say, well, they're just blessing two people. And I said, no, it says couple. And that's a big step forward. That is a big step forward. Because remember, as I said 2 or 3 years ago, when they said God does not bless sin. So before fiducia supplicans, Jack Bentz and I could not do that. Right? We could not legitimately bless a couple that would come up to us, right? Now we can. So it's a big change. But I think you're right. You know, everyone needs blessings. I think, as I said, that the nuances that it mentions same-sex couples and talks about them really in a positive way for the first time in church history. That's a big step forward. But good question.
Chris?
Yes, I was very happy to hear that you're somewhat optimistic about what's happened. I'm curious how much of this progress is because of Pope Francis. What might happen to it if we don't, if he doesn't continue to be Pope, you know, for however much longer he has, I hope it's a long time. And what would you consider sort of that we're moving in the right direction? What's next, the next step that would make you feel like things are continuing the way we hope they will?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I am optimistic. I mean, I think for a lot of people, Monday was a difficult day, or at least a confusing day. But again, I think the idea is, for me, is that this is the first time the church is really talking about these things on a universal level. I mean, we might have talked about them in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles or Blessed Sacrament or in New York or even, but I mean, to talk about it on a church-wide level is a big deal. To even acknowledge, I mean, they wouldn't even use the term sexual orientation 10 years ago. That was not used, right? To even acknowledge and even to have a synod where people talked about it openly is a big step forward. But that's a very insightful question. What would I see as another step forward? I think the key for me is more and more opportunities for church leaders, particularly in the Vatican, but also in chanceries, bishops and whatnot, to listen to the experiences of LGBTQ people. Now, I know in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, that happens, but in other places, it doesn't at all. I had a bishop come up to me from sub-Saharan Africa and said to me, the reason that there are gay people in my country is because Americans pay them to be gay. Yes. So now you might laugh and everything, but you know, this is a guy who believes this and who's telling you this, who's an archbishop, right? And so I would doubt that he has had much experience listening to LGBTQ people if he feels that they're the result of, you know, payoffs or bribes. So I think that a huge step forward would be for the church to listen to LGBTQ people, to have them on commissions, to really pay attention to what they're saying all over the world. And as I said, that's going to be hard, right? I mean, that's just a hard thing to do because we're still getting over the idea that there are LGBTQ people in the church. You know, the United States, we're very lucky. Some of these, you know, like Blessed Sacrament, right? You can go and you can feel comfortable. There's LGBT groups. You know, in places in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, the bishops in Ghana supported criminalizing homosexuality, and in Uganda as well. So there are places where a person can't even be open about it. So I think the first step is to listen. The second step is to welcome more explicitly. And then the third step would be advocate for them. I think Pope Francis has done many wonderful things. One of the most significant is coming out against the criminalization of homosexuality, which many people have been asking him to do for a long time. That's a big deal. As you know, in over 70 countries, it's illegal. In 10 countries, you can be executed. And again, what might seem a little bland over here is a big deal in Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa, where they don't even want to talk about it in many places. So those are the things I would hope for: listening, welcoming, and advocating.
Derek.
Oh, yeah. I was wondering, like, how has Lucius Supplicans been, like, how have you seen, like, it being implemented in, like, the US? Because there's obviously, like, bishops and places where, like, they would be open to it, but there's also a lot of bishops, cardinals, etc., that, like, would be opposed to say it kindly or, like, straight out, like, just refuse to do it. Like, how have you seen, like, in the past short time period, like, how has things been, like, how have you seen it being worked?
Yeah, so it's been generally accepted, I would say, but as you point out, there are quite a few bishops and dioceses who have said, you know, we will only do it under certain circumstances. The circumstances are so small that it's almost kind of eliminating it. There have been priests that have come out against it. So you're right. You know, in the United States, the situation is not all rosy. And some dioceses have said, oh, worldwide, we have to study it first. But it really is extraordinary. I mean, I often say, imagine this happening under any other pope. You know, that St. John Paul or Benedict XVI would put out something and bishops would publicly oppose it or publicly say we're not going to implement it. It's extraordinary. And as far as I can remember, I mean, I'm 63 years old. I don't remember that happening on the bishop level, on the episcopal level. But you know, I mean, it's all the more reason for us to continue to, you know, fight for and work for and strive for more and more inclusion. And what does that mean? That means encouraging bishops and priests and lay leaders to listen to the experiences of LGBTQ people. You know, I will say one of the things I said on the floor of the synod was telling the story of a gay couple I knew who had been together for 40 years. One of the people one of the guys named Carlos, it was Carlos and Jim. Carlos was a Eucharistic minister, a lector, a spiritual director, and a hospital chaplain at Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital, Cancer Hospital. So he was, you know, admirable pillar of the church. He got sick with cancer, and his husband, Jim, cared for him through tests, diagnoses, radiation, chemotherapy, surgery, and was with him, you know, all the way until he died. And I told that story. I only have 4 minutes. And I said, the question for the church is this love or not? Right. And a lot of people came up to me afterwards and said, thank you for saying that. Even people who were kind of opposed, like that was a really moving story. So I think to your question, the more bishops that can hear those kinds of stories and that can see that kind of love as real love, because I ended with the question, is this love or not? Right? The more acceptance I think there will be of that kind of, of the blessing at the most basic level. You know what I mean? That's the most basic level. So I think stories and listening and meeting people are just key. And it's happening slowly.
Other question? Next question. Yes.
Thanks for being here, Father Martin. A little bit of an open-ended question, but some context. So like I'm a pretty new Catholic. I come from like a Protestant background where obviously like primacy of conscience and your personal like walk with Christ is very important. But then coming into the Catholic Church, a lot more the tradition and sort of like obedience to like the teachings and to like what the church is handing down, which I'm very interested in and trying to like do the best I can. Obviously, coming into the Catholic Church as like a Christian is already a little bit of friction there. So I just wonder if you have like some words or thoughts about like obedience or like conscience versus obedience, or, like how to be a like strong gay Catholic while also like not just like discarding things that you don't want to keep.
Yeah, great question. I think there's 3 levels of it. The first level is to understand the Gospels. To understand the Gospels, to understand Jesus, to see Jesus, to meet Jesus in the Gospels, in prayer, in the sacraments, in your community, and to see someone who is continually going out to people in the margins. Usually when I give presentations like this, I talk about 3 gospel stories. The centurion, the Roman centurion, who's not even Jewish at all. He's not a monotheist, he's a pagan, using that term from back then. And Jesus heals his servant, right? So not an ounce of critique or criticism. He treats him with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Those are the 3 virtues the Catechism talks about in terms of LGBTQ people. The second story is the woman at the well, right? He meets a woman who has been married 5 times and is living with a man who's not her husband. So she has an irregular sexual past and present. Jesus reveals himself to her as the living water. She goes off as an apostle, someone sent to proclaim the good news. Also, he listens to her, he encounters her, he doesn't reject her. And the third story is the story of Zacchaeus. I have some of this online if you want to look it up. On our outreach, by the way, our outreach.faith website is a website, in case you don't know, for LGBTQ Catholics. And Zacchaeus is the man who's short in stature, right? He's little, he's a tax collector. I always say LGBTQ people often feel like they have little stature. He climbs a tree to see Jesus passing by. Jesus calls him down, even though people grumble. That's very important. Even though people grumble, Jesus continues to reach out to them. So when we meet Jesus in the Gospels, we see someone who is continually reaching out to people who feel marginalized or excluded or ignored. Okay. We also have to understand the biblical bases of some of the opposition to homosexuality. If you go on our outreach.faith site, you will see the outreach guide to the Bible and homosexuality. And bluntly put, we don't look at where Catholics are not fundamentalists or literalists. And I always say, people say, well, it's in the Bible, it's in, Leviticus, that homosexuality is an abomination. I also say, well, do you think women should be stoned for committing adultery? And they're like, no, of course not. It's like, why not? It's in the Bible. It's like, well, I think about those things differently now. So we have to understand even what the Bible says in its context. So that's the first thing, the Gospels, the Bible. Second thing is church teaching, understanding church teaching on homosexuality in its full range, including protecting LGBTQ people and treating them with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Third is your conscience. It sounds like a new teaching, but it's actually an ancient teaching that an informed conscience, meaning a conscience that understands the Gospels and church teaching and has prayed about it, is the final arbiter of the moral life. right? And so all those three things, the Gospels, church teaching, and conscience, need to be understood. So I think that's how LGBTQ people can make good moral decisions. Does that help?
Hello, good evening. I have questions. My name is Michael. I'm from Russia. My friends help me. I'm afraid I make mistake.
Okay, hi, Father, it's Paul. I'm a out member here on Thursdays. So Mike is our Russian member, and well, we know how the church is in Russia. I told him different church, but the question is that yeah, they say it turns out that each country has its own laws, and the church must comply with them because they're saying like we're thinking about the bigger love of Christ, like we were supposed to love each other, gay or not, and all that. So that's the message. So in Russia, even though they're Christian, they kind of are anti-gay. And as you're saying, in sub-Saharan churches, also they have, even though it's the same church, So how does it change? Why does it change? Do you think different countries?
Oh, is your question, why is it different in different countries? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Like, why would be like, how can't you talk over your bishop friend, for example, say, look, that's the lesson from Jesus. Like, why do they understand it differently?
I want to make sure I understand your question. Is your question, why do different bishops in different countries understand it differently? Is that the question?
Well, actually, Michael, the Russian is asking that has to do with some influence of the government. I think because the government obliged it or something that the churches to, be anti-gay or something like that.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I do. That's a very good question. I do think that in many countries here, this is actually, I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things I learned at the Synod was this. Why is there so much opposition? Okay, well, first, a lot of it's cultural. Okay, so you can be a bishop in country X, and if country X has a homophobic culture, you're going to naturally sort of take that in. That's the first thing. So cultural. When the African bishops talked, I'm not accusing them of being homophobic, but when the African bishops talked about in our cultures, this just would not work. That's what they were saying. And remember, some of them are coming from predominantly Muslim countries, right? And so that would be dangerous in a sense for priests theoretically to bless same-sex couples. All right, so there are cultural reasons. But I think you put your finger on something really important, which is also there's political reasons. So a lot of countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, have, the governments or the politicians or the leaders have coalesced around anti-LGBTQ policies. And so it's more difficult for bishops to, in a sense, not only stand up against the culture, but stand up against politics. All right, politicians with whom they have to work. But there's another thing that I learned. I don't think maybe it's not news to you guys, but a lot of the resistance comes from the way that U.S. aid, I know this sounds very specific, but I was told this many times, is often tied to protections for LGBTQ people, okay? So one of the conditions for aid from the West for many developing nations is protections for LGBTQ people, including same-sex marriage, which some people, particularly including bishops in some of these countries, view as a humiliation. In other words, you, the West, are telling us how we should do these things culturally, which is not part of our culture. Now, of course, the response is, well, then don't take the money, right? But they feel that, and I heard that word and it was really eye-opening for me. It is a humiliation. So when you put all these things together, when you put the reliance on, sort of biblical exegesis that may be, well, let me just say, when you put a reliance on sort of fundamentalist readings of Scripture, okay, when you look at kind of the problems culturally, when you think how difficult it is politically to go against these things, when you realize that a lot of these people really believe this, right? They're not just posturing. And when you see the humiliation that comes from what they see as colonialism, that's what I was told. It is colonialism. You are forcing this on us. It does become easier to understand why there's such a strong response, and also why it varies from country to country. Does that make sense? Yeah, so it's quite complex. I spent the last couple of months trying to talk to people who are on the other side, as it were, and really try to understand them. Like really, really try to understand. The other thing they bring up a lot, and like I said, I'm not saying this is all accurate, but the other thing that they believe is, in some countries, the LGBTQ community is the enemy of the church, right? So protests and things like that, and anti-Catholic protests during Pride parades that they see. I mean, it's very well to be, let's be clear, that's very selective, right? They're seeing a selective thing, and it may be magnified by social media. But all this kind of gives rise to this real virulent opposition to anything that talks about LGBTQ stuff. In some places, like I said, I think most people who were there understood that they wanted people of all sexual orientations and identities to feel welcome in general. Question is, how do we do that? Let me tell you that the discussion around that topic was very contentious. But you know, at least we talked about it, right? Wasn't covered up.
Thank you, Father Jim. And thank you for sharing about the gospel stories about Jesus and the three gospel stories that you mentioned. So, like you said, reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and experience with Jesus. And the other end of it, you have those so-called clobber passages where people can use that as a weapon as well. So what would you say in terms of people recognizing the clobber passages against the LGBT community? And how do we sort of defend ourselves against that type of rhetoric?
Yeah, I think the best thing, first of all, this is not an ad, but on outreach.faith, I do want to say this again. We have an entire series of articles from some of the best biblical scholars in the world on the outreach guide to the Bible and homosexuality. It's going to be a book in another year or so. It's excellent. And the basic thing to understand about some of these clobber verses, which are taken out of context, is a couple. I mean, you can read an article by Walter Brueggemann, the great scripture scholar, Amy Jill Levine, Richard Clifford. They all make the point that we have to understand the context. All right. They did not understand homosexuality in the same way that we did, or we do, right? Stable, monogamous relationships between people. Often it was about rape or a power differential, but more to the point, we understand Bible verses from Leviticus and even from St. Paul in a different way than they did back then, and we should. In other words, this. Do we think that people who commit adultery should be stoned? No, we do not. Do we think the most forceful example, do we think that people should be enslaved? No, we do not. But in Leviticus, they have rules for who can be a slave and who cannot be a slave. Now, so when people say to you, well, it's in the Bible, I think the most helpful thing is to say, let's talk about some other things that are in the Bible. Do you believe in slavery? Well, of course not. Why not? Well, because it's wrong and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's in the Bible. I think that's the most effective way of handling it. To remind people that we see these things different, right? Because we've changed. We understand these things in a different light. So it is wrong. And if you're going to sort of understand the whole Bible in context, you can't just cherry pick one verse about homosexuality and say, that's the one I'm against. So read this outreach guide to the Bible and homosexuality, and we'll give you lots of ways to respond. And not just, I want to be clear about this, not just like ammunition, because it's not just about winning the debate. It's really understanding it. It's really saying that, look, this is accurate. We have progressed as human beings, and we do not think the same way that people did in Leviticus about killing people for planting two different kinds of crops in the same field, right? We don't do that anymore, and we shouldn't do it anymore. And, Amy Jill Levine, you're all welcome to the Outreach Conference, which is going to be at Georgetown this summer, between August 2nd and August 1st. I was on a panel with Harold Atman, a great biblical scholar from Yale, Amy Jill Levine, tremendous Bible scholar, Brandon Robertson, a young Bible scholar, and another fellow named Grant Hartley, talking about the Bible and homosexuality. It was packed. And I brought up this point. I said, well, Amy Jill, what I often tell people is this, that, we don't stone people for adultery any longer. And she said, well, they probably didn't back then either. I said, what do you mean? She said, these are rules. These are kind of rules to sort of frighten people from doing things. That didn't mean that they went around stoning people constantly or killing people constantly. So we have to understand that as well. But I urge you to go on outreach.faith and look at our guide to the Bible and homosexuality. It's very helpful.
Yes.
Thank you, Father. My name is Reg. I will be brief. I thank you from my heart. I feel very emotional tonight. I especially appreciate your message of positivity and optimism. I never thought I would be living through events like this in the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, certainly not under Pope Paul VI or Pope Pius XII, that's for sure. So thank you for filling my heart with that positive sense and a sense of joy tonight.
You're welcome, and thanks for wearing the Penn shirt. I will say, I think, in light of, the document that came out on Monday, it's good to sort of take the long view, to step back a little bit and to see what Pope Francis has done in the last 10 years. All right, the first thing is he's the first Pope ever to use the word gay. Okay. He has talked about people not pushing their kids out because they're gay publicly. His 5 most famous words are, "Who am I to judge?" That was about gay priests, right? And then gay everybody. He has an openly gay man, Juan Carlos Cruz, who's a good friend of his, who's on a papal commission, openly gay. I met with him when I was in Rome in October. He met with Sister Janine Gramick from New Ways Ministry. I've met him 4 times now, right? And we almost always talk about LGBTQ stuff. So he meets regularly with transgender people. All right. So he really has, as far as he can, I would say, right? He's also trying to keep the church together. I think as we're talking about this, I think Fiducia Supplicans offers us a little bit of a case in point. So here's Pope Francis and Cardinal Fernandez trying to move the ball forward, okay? But they see what kind of reaction it gets. He's trying to be the Pope of everybody. And I think he's trying to sort of balance things out a little bit, right? And so we have to kind of keep that in mind too. So he's trying his best, I think. I sincerely believe this, and he is sincere about trying to welcome people, but he also knows that he may have to go a little more slowly for other parts of the church. Let's actually, I've never thought about this before. Might be a good analogy. It's like coming out. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have come out, right? This might be a good analogy. Maybe to your close, let's say you came out when you were, depending on your age, maybe you were in your 20s, maybe you're in your teens, maybe you just came out a couple of years ago. You tell people different things. You might tell your best friend everything. I'm out, I'm this, I'm dating, you might tell your brothers and sisters a little less. You might tell your mom or your dad very little. You might tell your grandparents a lot, You know how that is. So why do you do that? It's not that you're being dishonest, and it's not that you're being sort of despairing, right? Or insincere. You're recognizing that some people can hear things and some people can't. You're kind of gauging it, right? We all do that. So I wonder if that might be a good image of Pope Francis and the Vatican and the church. Some people are, what I'm trying to say is ready for this, and some people aren't. Right? And that's just where they are. That doesn't mean that you cut off your, I'm not going to talk to anybody who doesn't accept me 100%, right? But I think people are more nuanced than that. So That may be one way of looking at it, and yet you're still moving ahead. Maybe one more question.
Yeah, I had a question. I love what you said about using the Gospels when you're trying to explain our experience as queer Christians, and I really believe I read the Gospels back to back, and after I read it, I felt very sure that if Jesus were to come back today, he would accept me and love me as a queer Christian, accept our community. And what some people take those Gospels and say, well, Jesus was reaching out to sinners in order to change them, in order to heal them and make them change their ways. And my question is, what would you suggest we as queer Christians do to explain that it was a love of accepting us as we are? And the second part of that is, do you feel that Pope Francis also believes that, of accepting in the queer community to then change them, or if it's more that this is just stepping stones for him to open up?
I'll start with the second part, which is easier. I definitely think Pope Francis doesn't talk about changing people like in that way, because he has said to people, God made you this way, right? That's a quote. So I don't think he's into like conversion therapy or anything like that. The first, but we're all called to conversion. We're all called to different kinds of conversion, or the way that the gospel talks about it is metanoia. I like that word even better, which is kind of like a change of life, right? It's not just one thing. That sometimes gets mistranslated in the gospels as repentance, which is much narrower. Repentance is about sorrow for your sins and not doing your sins again. Metanoia is much broader. It's a whole kind of change of life. Your first question is a great question. Actually, can you stand so I can see? I can't really even see who I'm talking to. There we go. Okay, how are you? I was going to make a little bit of a joke, but when you said if Jesus came back, what would he do? Well, actually, Jesus has come back. He's risen, and he does love you. So it's not just a hypothetical. I know you didn't mean it that way, but he has come back. He is risen, and through the Spirit, he loves you, right? The whole thing about Jesus wants us all it's just about being sinful. Look, what do I say to that? I would say we're all sinful. That's right. We're all called to conversion. We're all sinful. And LGBTQ people are no more sinful than anybody else. So this kind of love the sinner, hate the sin, I think that's, people use that just against LGBTQ people. They never talk about anybody else like that, like some straight married couple. So I always say to people, 80% of straight married couples in the United States believe there's no moral problem with birth control. If I were to give a talk to straight married couples, no one would say, don't forget, tell them, love the sinner, hate the sin. They just don't talk like that about people. So we have to get away from this idea of labeling LGBTQ people as the only people who are in any way, imperfect. We're all sinful. We're all called in different ways to conversion. And I think, the people whom Jesus reaches out most to and is kindest to are those people who are really excluded. And I agree with you. I think if Jesus were to come back physically today, I think he'd be right with the transgender homeless person, the transgender homeless youth. I mean, I really do. The most marginalized people. Yeah, so I am very hopeful. I'm not just saying that to be, Jack knows me. I'm not just like Pollyannish. I think, the Holy Spirit is moving things. I think we have to be, as with the coming out analogy, there's going to be steps backwards. There's going to be people you come out to who, they reject you, or they're upset, or they say something hurtful, right? And so it's a process, and the church is, in a sense, the church is kind of experiencing this coming out. Frankly, I may write about this. That I like this analogy a lot. So thank you for eliciting it. Listen, I just want to say thank you for all the great work you do at your parish with the group. You are all ambassadors of Christ who are all called to not only accept Christ in your own lives, but really, carry that love of Christ and the wonderful gospel message of inclusion and welcome to all you meet. And I hope this little session has helped you see kind of where the church is, so you can kind of answer questions better. So thanks very much. Keep me in your prayers. And yeah, hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you, Jim.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot. Bye, Jack.
Well, thanks again for coming out tonight. There's plenty of.